You're watching Inside Utah Politics.
Time now to debate some of the big stories of the week with the Inside Utah Politics panel. This week we have State Representative Brian King and State Auditor John Dougal. Gentlemen, great to have you with us. Thanks for being here.
Thank you.
And thank you for the last minute save. We appreciate you coming in on the last second.
Anything for you, Glenn.
All right, that's the House Minority Leader right there. Okay, let's start off with Medicaid expansion. This is a really big deal. Okay, open enrollment now open as of the 1st. We weren't expecting it under the modification plan to happen until the summer, but it still comes a year after voters approved it. Talk about the process that led up to this point.
Well, the good news is that we've got it. And we passed Medicaid expansion a year ago in Proposition 3. Voters passed it by a good margin, and the legislature just couldn't help but mess with it. And so we went in fairly quickly in the session and we changed it. We put in some changes that I voted against, that most of the Democrats voted against. And they didn't get the Medicaid waivers from CMS, the Center for Medicare and Medicaid Resources. And so we had to start over, basically. And I'm glad that we're putting in place Medicaid expansion. That's the good news. The sad news, the bad news is that we waited a year and we've lost literally hundreds of millions of dollars.
John, let's bring you in. Did you support the efforts that they were trying to make little unique changes to this plan along the way? Do you think it was worth it?
I think given the concerns with Medicaid, not just in Utah, but nationwide, it was important for the legislature to try and figure out some way to put some bounds on it. Unfortunately, they did not get that. But when you look at Medicaid in other states, it consumes every dollar that's in its path, whether that's public education, higher ed, transportation. You see problems with Medicaid expansion and the lack of financial controls on it. And so it was appropriate for the legislature to try and find some way to place some controls on it. Unfortunately, they were unsuccessful.
Okay, let's take a look at it moving forward. What do you expect to see happen? Because a lot of the talk and the concern around this was that the woodwork effect. You know, so many people would come in and it would overburden the system, wouldn't be able to afford it. How do you see it playing out from here?
Well, the reality is that the enrollment has increased, obviously, when you have greater levels of coverage, but the woodwork effect has not been nearly as great as people expected, which is a good thing in the sense that it's not as costly. John's concerns about costs are valid. But remember, the voters in the state of Utah a year ago said, we're willing to increase the sales tax by some increment to cover those costs. And we don't have much reason to think that the number of people that are going to be getting on a Medicaid expansion is so high that we can't afford it.
We did not see that when we covered up to 100% of the federal poverty level. Now we're moving up to 138%. John, any concerns moving forward as we take that step?
As I mentioned before, when I talk with my colleagues in other states, they're concerned with the entitlement nature of Medicaid and how it just expands to consume whatever's in its path. And so I think going forward, where Utah really has to watch is what's he going to do to public ed funding. That's going to be the key thing that most people are concerned about, because those two programs are going to go head to head in funding.
And that's a good transition to our next topic when we get into public education, because we had the tax reform bill. We're now seeing a citizen referendum, trying to reverse that, taking it to the voters. How do you see that playing out? Gathering signatures now, it's not an easy threshold here in the state of Utah. Do you see them getting on the ballot?
You know, I think there's been a lot of momentum just in the last couple of weeks on this. I've been surprised at how angry people have been and how many people have said, we want to help gather signatures. You got to get over 100,000 and you got to get them in like about half the counties across the state. It's not as high a threshold as for the initiatives, but it's still a high threshold. I'm going to be really interested. I hope that the population is energized and mobilized to the degree that they come out and they say, we want to get this on the ballot. I'd love to see what Utahns think of that tax reform as a state.
John, do you see this effort getting on the ballot and ultimately in front of the voters of Utah?
It is a very, very high bar, so it's going to be very difficult for them to get on the ballot. So we'll have to see what happens there. But the key thing that's going to be good is it forces a dialogue about what took place in the restructuring, so folks can learn what's in there, what isn't in there, what they like, what they don't like. Both have legislators talk about why they think it's good or why they're concerned with it, and have the public express why they support it or why they're concerned, or the different aspects of it.
Let's get into why this bill is unpopular. We've had the governor come out lately, the Utah Taxpayers Association, and say, look, get to know the facts of this because it is a tax cut, a significant one on the income tax side. Why is this facing so much opposition?
I think it's because you have two very basic taxes that are increasing. Number one, sales tax on food is increasing for everybody. And you can say, well, it doesn't really hit the poor as much as it could because we put in place some mechanisms to mitigate that impact on the poor. But the reality is, once you have a low sales tax rate when you just go buy the stuff, 1.75. You realize the benefit right then. You don't have to jump through the hoops that we put in place in the special session to get that money back. But the second thing that's really regressive, that really hits everybody hard, is the increase in the fuel taxes, and especially folks in rural Utah. Those are the individuals who drive more than people who live right along the Wasatch Front. That is going to result in a significant pocketbook hit for people across the state of Utah.
John, this is bringing together Democrats and Republicans fighting against it. From a conservative standpoint, why is this an unpopular bill?
Well, I think one of the key things is the process. In addition to the factors Brian mentioned, the process is something that I've heard a lot of concern with from the public. The bill that first came out in February missed its mark in terms of what it was trying to do versus what was its outcome. The legislature stood back, which was good, tried to inform the public, but the public didn't feel like they were being brought along through the process. Then they felt like special session in December between the holidays. And so I think a lot of folks are concerned, even if they like some aspects of the bill, are concerned about process. And tax reform is difficult, and informing the public is even more difficult when it comes to something as complex as tax policy.
Let's dig into that a little more, because you talk about the bill coming out in February. We had a task force traveling the state, several public town hall meetings where people came out and gave their opinions and inputs. It did happen in a special session, but do you have to give the task force credit for getting out and giving people at least the opportunity to weigh in?
No, I think that's true. I appreciate the fact that we didn't go plunge ahead in the last session, that they took several months and travel the state. And the Democrats, likewise, we had 7 town hall meetings as a House Democratic Caucus to get people's input, to find out what their concerns were. I'll tell you the thing that troubles me the most about, and it ties into John's comments about process, is one of the huge components of this tax reform piece was to cut $500 million each year out of the education fund with no provision for how we move forward to replace that or to deal with that. Now, we're going to deal with that in the next session. That's going to be one of the huge issues we deal with next month. But between now and then, I mean, that's uncertainty is the process concern, part of the process.
Yeah,
concern.
we've definitely heard the message that this is a starting point. We're going to make some fixes in the session. What fixes would you like to see in the session?
I'm not sure what fixes I'd like to see in the session right now, but one of the key things is going back where people don't understand what was taking place is the issue of different amounts in different buckets. You know, hearing that we don't have a revenue problem, we just have an allocation problem is a hard concept for the public to understand. And so they're going to be clearly fine-tuning what that is and what that message is, because that is the hard thing for folks to understand. What do you mean? You're cutting taxes, but you need more revenue. It's a revenue allocation challenge.
Okay, let's dig into that a little more, though. Earmarked income tax for education. The governor is saying, look, I wouldn't sign this if we were still not dedicated to funding education. And if you take a look at the last 5 years, the legislature's put a lot of new money into education. Are you still concerned that now that that earmark's not there, that funding may not be there if we see a downturn in the economy?
Yeah, I am concerned. I mean, the reality is we do still have the earmark there, and we can't get rid of that earmark until we have the public.
Right.
acting
The point
to
I was
reduce
making
it.
is the earmark, but we're cutting that rate quite a bit.
So basically what we did is we've cut the revenue for the education fund by $500 million a year without dealing with the reality that we've got to have some way of replacing that. And I think the feeling is we'll go into the session, we'll pass a bill that gets rid of the earmark, which I think is going to be a hard thing to convince a lot of people that we should do it all. But having done that, if it passes by 2/3 margins in both the House and the Senate, then it goes to the ballot, and the people of the state of Utah will decide in November. Do we want to remove the earmark? And that's going to be a pitched battle.
John.
Well, and to Brian's point, cutting the income tax also had an increase in the sales tax. There was a net cut overall, but still you're going to have higher ed that's currently being funded with income tax being shifted over to be funded more with sales tax. And so it's not like you had a straight cut of $500 million to public education. But yeah, you're going to be looking at the earmark question. I think that's going to be a heavy lift for the legislature. But that is something that folks are going to be talking about.
All right, and we'll be
Transportation funding, I think, is going to be another big thing. And how do you fund transportation? Because really, at the end of the day, what was the critical issue? It wasn't really the sales tax. It was the transportation fund. The gas tax is dying. It's hard for us to want to talk about how to fund infrastructure when we're so used to using the gas tax. But I drive an electric car. I don't pay a gas tax. How do you fund the infrastructure when you can bypass the taxing mechanism?
All questions we'll be looking into as time moves forward, and we'll be in the session in a couple of weeks, gentlemen. Great conversation. Thanks so much for being here. Appreciate your time. Stay with us. We'll be right back with more Inside Utah Politics right after the break.